Welcome back, everyone. I hope you've had an opportunity to greet a new neighbor. Perhaps you had a chance to add your thoughts to our topical flip charts and enjoyed a beverage or two during the break. Our next session is now, and it focuses on the direction of peace studies. I'm delighted now to introduce the moderator of our first panel, Fred Pearson. Fred is the director. Yes, let's hear it for Fred. Fred is the director of the Center for Peace and Conflict Studies. He's a professor of political science and a distinguished faculty fellow at Wayne State University in Detroit. Dr. Pearson will introduce the topic and our first panel and his panelists. Dr. Fred Pearson, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you so much, and it's great to see this actually happening. I hope that in mentioning where we're from and where I'm from in the Wayne State, that he also mentioned I'm a member proudly of the Detroit Rotary Club, which is a co-sponsor, and very happy to be a co-sponsor. Might I introduce our panelists who are with us today, representing some of the most prominent peace studies programs in the world, and you'll be hearing from them in turn. We have Professor Owen Greene of the Peace Studies Center at Bradford University in the United Kingdom. Professor Greene, Bradford, I should say, is one of the Rotary's 6 global peace centers, providing graduate education to mid-career and young aspiring peacemakers all over the world. Bradford, as a matter of fact, goes from undergraduate to PhD level work, and Owen Greene is renowned for his work on, among other things, small arms reduction and the post-conflict peace building, particularly in countries that have suffered civil wars. Very happy to have Owen. Also with us, Professor Sean Byrne of the Arthur Morrow Center for Peace and Justice at the University of Manitoba, Canada. Sean is director of the center and professor of peace studies, and he has received prestigious research grants in both Canada and the United States to carry on his research, which has often centered on and been really path-breaking about the reconciliation of Northern Ireland and the Irish Republic. Professor Robert Johansen comes to us from the Joan Kroc Center at Notre Dame University, Professor Emeritus of Political Science and Peace Studies. Notre Dame is renowned as one of the prominent U.S. centers teaching peace studies, conflict resolution, again, all the way from the undergraduate to the PhD level. Professor Johansen is noted for his work on the trade-off between human interest and national interest. You heard Professor Sachs talking about these kinds of questions of becoming immersed as world citizens, and Professor Johansen will perhaps be able to tell us more about how to do that. So it's my honor to just give you a few introductory remarks about what we're into when we talk about the direction of peace studies. Peace studies is a recognized field of academics. It has journals which are well known in the world, publishing about our research findings. And we're talking today about the direction of peace studies in the world. You've heard early this morning that peace, of course, is defined either as negative or positive, in a sense. Negative peace dealing with how to stop violence, how to either prevent or reduce or stop the physical violence that takes place so many places in our communities, in our lives, and of course abroad, across the world. But positive peace also redounds to the question of how do we deal with justice? Because as you know, there's the old slogan, no justice, no peace. There's a good song about it, I believe. And that's the deeper meaning of how do you resolve the underlying issues that lead toward the breakout of violence. You've heard from both Jody Williams and Jeffrey Sachs this morning about how poverty and other underlying issues break out, unfortunately, so often in the wars we witness. So we have that linkage. Now, we in peace studies look at it from different levels. The levels can be the individual level, where people are, good or bad with each other, where they are actually able to solve their conflicts or not. And here there have been some inspirational individuals in our life, in our recollection. I just invite you to think about a Nelson Mandela, for instance, and the meaningful difference that he made as a personal agent for peace and reconciliation in a country that everyone thought was very likely to descend into civil war at some point, to transition to majority rule. Mandela made that not happen, and that's inspiring for us. So there are people at the individual level who do that, and in our everyday lives, learning how to solve disputes more effectively, let's say between police and our communities, is a vital necessity which we also study. So that's the individual level. The group level obviously also makes a difference. And here among the findings, the group at the state level, for instance, what does it mean about democracy and peace, for instance? What does democracy do or not do for peace building, for creating conditions of peace? We like to think that it's a kind of an inspirational that we have in democracy ways of dealing with conflict that are procedurally accepted by people, that are institutionally valid, where we don't just kill and throw people in jail willy-nilly. We ideally have rules and norms for how to do this better. And there's indeed a theory that democracies in the world, if they build up, may or may not be more prone to fight each other. We are not sure about that in the field. We research about that. It's called democratic peace theory, but it's an intriguing idea. And we do think that Western ideals in some cases can be important in world affairs to settling disputes if we indeed even abide by them ourselves. At the final level, the international level, we have a debate about how to make peace, essentially between those who argue that it's institutional building. It's the role of Rotary, it's the role of civil society groups that bridge gaps between people and establish essentially rules and norms expected to be good behavior. And that's called liberal institutionalism, and some people adhere to it through the United Nations, for instance, and frameworks like that, creating conditions and states of mind that lead toward peace. On the other side, we have those who are maybe a little more cynical and believe that peace is only possible through deterrence, through armed relationships that deter each other from violence. And there are those who want to prepare militarily. You heard Jeff Sachs refer to it, but there are people who genuinely believe that this does lead toward leaving each other alone. There's some evidence on the side that says maybe we had a long period of peace in the Cold War era because both the U.S. and the Soviets, in a way, were mutual allies against what we might call non-existence. That is, that nuclear weapons, which are a terror in our lives, and are becoming more terrible, by the way, at the moment, do give people pause about jumping into violence with each other and not knowing where it might lead. We hope that people do take pause and be careful about the exercise of force. But then again, force can lead to force. Escalation can surprise us. We came very close to total disaster in the Cuban Missile Crisis, almost without knowing it, as the Americans and the Russians did not communicate with each other, and some very alarming near-war things happened without either side being aware that they were about to happen. So you can't always rely on deterrence. Accidental war, war by miscalculation, war by ignoring signs can be a great danger. So we have these debates about how is best to keep the peace or preserve and lay the groundwork for peace. So with that, I want to turn it over to my colleagues for them to fill us in on the direction of peace science, so to speak, at their respective institutions and as they see it in the field of peace studies. So I believe we're going in order to here, and we're going to lead off with, I believe, Professor Greene, is that right? Who's going to talk a little bit about his work and about his views on how peace is best achieved.
Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks very much for inviting me. As you can hear, I come from the UK, where we have a big centre in Bradford, which collaborates with Rotary in various ways. Of course, we want time for discussion and Q&A, and so I have prepared some slides, but I'll be dwelling particularly on the last two. But let's proceed. So, Peace and Studies at Bradford. Fred asked me just to make a few points about what we do at Bradford, just to introduce myself and others. We've been going for about 40 years, which makes us one of the oldest peace studies departments in the world. It's a full peace studies department in the sense we have undergraduates, masters, postgraduates. We do a lot of training. We engage a lot with the world in so many different ways. There is a debate in peace studies as to whether or not peace studies is a discipline which has to have its own founding concepts, or whether it's a multidisciplinary area where we just try and promote peace and understand it in the best ways we can. And we take the second view. It's multidisciplinary, and that's reflected in everything we do and how we work. We're also a very applied department, which I think is very important. We take it as our mission, but it's not only a mission statement, that we should be educating and researching the world in order to better understand it and prepare people for the world, but also that our work should aim to change it for the better. And so in that context, you can't do that simply by researching and teaching. You've got to engage with practitioners, you've got to engage with communities around the world. And that's what we do. So we work in a whole host of different ways, in all continents, in different ways, running from small communities, urban areas, through to governments and so on. So we're proud to be a part of the Peace Research Fellows Initiative. It's one of the best things that Rotary International does, I think. It's a very inspirational program. We're really lucky, along with other 6 centres around the world, to receive some really marvellous, talented students selected jointly by us and Rotary, who are committed not only to studying, and they're ready for studying, they're very talented academically, but also committed to make use of that. And here's a picture of them all dressed up. I've got various dressed down pictures as well, but I don't have time to show you just for the last batch. But we're very proud of them, and they work obviously with the rest of our students there. So we teach, almost everything that Fred just mentioned obviously was in the survey of what we'd like to talk about. And we don't have time here, so I'm just listing a whole range of areas in which we do a lot of research, which obviously, and teaching and policy engagement, and they're all very live areas, and you can read them on the slides. And it's the sort of thing you'd expect a well-rounded peace studies department which is trying to influence across the range of those issues to be doing. Just recently, for example, a founding father of peace studies, founding parent of peace studies, Adam Curl, who was our first chair. We just had our centenary conference a few months ago. You can see the key banner there, documenting people's agency in war. That's only one element of what we're doing, but it was just a reflection of the fact that it's that grounded sort of research that we do. And here are a couple of dubious individuals that you can't quite see, John Paul Laderack and Tom Woodhouse, famous and associated with Bradford, along with other things. So I'm going to dwell now for the rest of my presentations on this slide and the next. How many things to say? And I think, because we need to be engaged, obviously an awful lot of what we do, we need to not only understand the world, but understand how we're influencing others to try, and ourselves, to improve the world. And we've got to recognize, I think, that over the last 25 years, people in the broad peace research community, peace studies community, have contributed a lot. We're not only, but we've contributed a lot, and I list some there. Recognizing the complexity of conflict, there's an awful lot of oversimplicity around. And therefore, a lot of responses to conflict, if they don't understand it properly, do harm, even if it's well-intentioned. So we've contributed to that. Understanding a whole host of different ways of making more effective conflict prevention activities. Understanding that positive peace, negative peace, they're often polarized, but actually in practice for most people around the world, and certainly in those living in fragile states, and also obviously conflict-affected states, there's an intimate correlation between the fears of violence and insecurity that they have and the actual experience of it, and their potential for development. We've done lots of work, as have others around the world, analyzing that. There is a sort of tradition which sort of says you do development, you do conflict management, and somehow, although they respect each other, they shouldn't intimately interrelate. They have to if you're dealing with ordinary people's development in the world and the capacity for them to create positive peace for themselves. And so that's meant taking on an awful lot of precepts in international institutions. There was a time when the development community didn't like to get involved with security issues and violence issues. Too political, too complicated, you might be mixing with the wrong sorts of people. But you can't do it. It's just you're not going to understand the situation well enough unless you do that engagement. Of course, that raises all sorts of issues about ensuring you are being ethical and effective, and so on. So we do a lot of work in that area. And I think along that list you can trace, since the end of the Cold War, where the political space internationally in a lot of areas expanded greatly to mobilize coalitions to do stuff on this area, to research it, to have the space in various conflict-affected countries, fragile states, developing countries, transitional countries from dictatorship to democracy, to have some space which is created through locals, conditions of government, and international community able and willing to take some steps to do something. And I think, although peace studies spends an awful lot of time criticizing, quite sensibly, what's actually happened, there were real achievements. And I think my main point as we lead to discussion here is that these achievements, we've got to recognize that these achievements are at risk. I'm an optimist, as Josie said. I'm not sure whether I'm a pessimist with optimism or whether I'm an optimist with pessimism, but you just got to be real and understand the world as it is, because otherwise you don't do good. If you dream away and you don't test your understanding, nearly everything we think we know is only imperfectly understood. And so you've got to keep on doing that. But a lot was achieved. And so I take the story two steps forward, one step back, rather than that's my optimism, rather than one step forward, two steps back in the world today. But we should recognize that a lot of us, including people in Bradford and others, have spent a lot of time working within a broad framework that if only we persuade our own governments to further move, and we can confidently critique a lot of what was done in terms of aid practices, in terms of peace-building practices and so on, we can progress. And the experience has shown that. Over the last, I would say, 10 years, there's been a very creative lesson-learning process where all sorts of theories and ideas that peace studies people and others felt would work in the world were tried out at various levels, and we learned they partially worked. We also began to learn how to scale some of those up. One thing we know about fragile states is that however weak that government is, it's strong enough to interfere with good stuff if it wants. And therefore you've got to build coalitions that build some resilience in those programs and enable groups to scale up. So it's not just a good initiative which closes down once a certain momentum is gone. We also understood better how to relate to some of those things, and we should acknowledge that. And I think we need to think quite hard about how we, through peace research as well as through our own personal activism, understand best how to defend some of the achievements that have been made. Because at least across a lot of Europe, there's a lot of cynicism. And frankly, a lot of people like us sometimes can be quoted to feed into that cynicism. This thing didn't work, therefore why do aid? This thing didn't work, therefore why continue with the policy, which has been hard achieved in a lot of European countries, that 50% of international aid goes to fragile and conflict-affected countries, where there's most dramatic human need. And so that means, obviously, activism and engagement, discussion, but it also means going back and testing and learning what we most want to preserve out of the experience that we've achieved over the last period and how best to build that sustainability. So this is not a very theoretical sense in my choice of what's one thing to single out as a general message in terms of the future of peace research. But we've got to take for granted that a lot of the narratives that are running, not only in the US, but across the world, and I can tell you they never started off in Russia and a lot of other places, about how better to doing good, are under severe challenge. And so one of the challenges for us is to know what we should defend despite imperfections. And that requires some serious reflection on how to, on what the experience is and to move to the next step. It's not to stop being critical, but it's to keep a sense of perspective. I mean, so for example, I'm British, and so therefore I should not comment on US politics. But you know, I fear, well I will, just the same as it's entirely legitimate for you to go back and discuss UK politics here, because we have all sorts of problems too. But in this context, we can consider, and I do, and everybody in Britain sort of feels they should have a vote in the US elections. We feel close enough to each other, so we follow those debates about what's going on. Exactly. But in that context, we should recognize that one of the challenges is that the shifts of power and influence in the world are profoundly changing. Broadly for good, because it reflects a dispersion of power more widely across the world. But quite basic principles of liberal internationalism and peace building and human rights and so on are under challenge, and they always have been, of course, across most of the world. But where there is a relatively united West, which retains some influence, which continues to espouse those violence, but also tries to follow up on it, and there's some mobilization, it makes the world of difference to what happens in northern Uganda or parts of Cambodia and all of those areas. And so in that context, we need to recognize it's not only a debate amongst ourselves between Europe and the West, but it is a debate about how best to preserve space for all of those other localities, which is where the greatest human insecurity and need is. And so I would end on that note. And I'm glad to see that the rather efficient lady that I was told was in a red dress right in front of me has just shown me the 2-minute sign. So I'm slightly ahead of time. So thank you very much.
So next up, Professor Byrne, Sean Byrne, will give us his direction.
Thank you. Good morning. How are you all doing? Hi, my name is Sean Byrne. I'm the director of the Arthur Murrow Centre for Peace and Justice at St. Paul's College at the University of Manitoba. I would like to recognize my colleagues for the wonderful work that they have done in their careers in peace studies. I'd also like to thank Dr. Pearson for inviting me here today, and Rotary. I'm very proud to be here and to be part of this conversation. I'd like to acknowledge Rotary for the wonderful work that it's doing and its vision for the future. I would also like to recognize some of the Rotarians from Winnipeg that are here today, David Newman and his wife Brenda. I've been asked to speak about sort of the accomplishments and challenges in the field, and to sort of situate myself in peace studies. As you can tell from my brogue, I'm not from Canada or indeed from the United States. I'm from Northern Ireland, and my parents came from both sides of the divide. And I learned about conflict at a very young age, watching how my parents handled it. But also, and I was very taken with Professor Jody Williams' comments today on the role of strong women in peace building. My grandmother was a farmer. She wasn't formally educated, but she was the go-to mediator in our community. And I remember hanging on to her skirt in her parlor as she mediated disputes between local neighbors from both sides of the conflict. So that's how I kind of got involved in peace and conflict studies. I want to recognize Rotary's accomplishments. I remember a couple of years ago in the Cregan in Derry, or Londonderry, depending on your political persuasion, sitting with a senior Republican discussing the peace-building process and some of the challenges that were to face the communities in the future. And one of the issues we were talking about was the Flags and Emblems Act. As you know, both communities adhere to different flags. The British flag, if you're from the Protestant Unionist Loyalist community, and the tricolour, the Irish flag, if you're from the Catholic Nationalist Republican community. And he made a very profound comment. He said, "You cannot eat a flag." And I think that's very important. So in the face of this very destructive war that really impacted the welfare of the communities over 30 years, he recognized as we move forward out of violence that the challenges for the politicians and for local community leaders was to really focus on the welfare, the economic welfare of both communities. So the idea is that we need jobs, we need employment, we need equity across the communities. I think in terms of peace studies, I moved to the University of Manitoba from a program we started in South Florida with Dr. Jessica Senahi, and we started a PhD program in 2006 and a joint master's program with the University of Winnipeg in 2010. There are 20 alumni of the PhD program, 15 alumni of the master's program, and there are 88 students in both graduate programs, so from 35 different countries. So what we're seeing is this hunger, if you will, for international students to become part of this field. And I just want to, recognize that there are, a lot of undergraduate, over 300 undergraduate programs in North America and over 56 graduate programs, as well as new and emerging programs. I'm hearing all the time of new programs developing around the world. So I think that's very, very positive, that in the face of great challenges, that young people are turning to this field to try to look at the issues and come up with some answers to guide humanity. I think also the movement away from what Johan Galtung, one of the founders of our field, he talked about negative peace, just looking at the absence of war, to focusing on more social justice issues like economic and ecological well-being, non-violence and reconciliation, for example. As I say, bringing the local in to the peace process. I think the challenge for peace studies is to, there's a saying that two neighbors that have a McDonald's won't go to war with each other. Professor Pearson talked about the democratic peace theory. So the idea that we have this sort of matrix of how to build peace in societies, especially in societies coming out of very violent wars, is a challenge. Can external economic aid build peace, for example? And then we have to look at the sort of mechanics of that aid and how it's distributed and the bureaucratization of that aid. Where is the local in peace building? So we have these external actors, external organizations, or coming in to try to assist in societies. Can you mix local and external approaches, sort of in a hybrid approach, taking the best of each and sort of really focusing on the reality of the situation? Or is justice being neglected? What kind of peace is being built in these societies? So that's what I want to sort of focus the remainder of my discussion on, as I see it, sort of more social justice, bringing the local in. So I think creativity and innovation in terms of peace pedagogies is a really important. And there are a number of important tools. My colleague Dr. Senahi is going to be talking about storytelling as one of those in a little while, but helping to build people's resiliency at the local level. So street theater, music, sports, therapeutic arts, clowning. There's an interesting international organization called Clowns Without Borders that go into, well, no, seriously, we've had them to our Winnipeg International Storytelling Festival that work with children that have been traumatized by violence in refugee camps, and they're doing tremendous work. Inclusive local civil society voluntary organizations that are working with people, local leaders being involved in peace process, and looking at the agency of local people using, as Professor Jody Williams said, nonviolent action to challenge unjust structures and systems. Ensuring social justice for vulnerable and marginalized groups, such as disabled citizens, girls, indigenous people, and people from the LGBTQ community. I mean, if you think about it, in Northern Ireland, over 3,000 people were murdered or killed in the conflict, but over 50,000 people were disabled by the violence. So where is their voice? Where is their input in the peace process? And that's just one example. I think very critically, including indigenous people's knowledge with regard to the environment and ecology is critical. And if you think about it, even in terms of the United States, the US system of government is built on the Iroquois Confederacy model, the Iroquois Six Nations of upstate New York. So indigenous knowledge, indigenous approaches to peace building, I think is very important when we go into situations to work with local people. But also recognizing that peace building itself is messy, it's untidy, and it's unpredictable. It includes a heterogeneity of actors, and as a number of my colleagues like Roger McGinty and Michael Pugh have argued, the IKEA model of peace building just doesn't work. So with that, I want to thank you. I think I've stayed within my time and appreciate your attention. Thank you so much.
And Professor Byrne, I might just add, has developed sort of a concept and a viewpoint called cubism for analyzing conflict, and he does it at these various levels, and you can see that very well in his presentation, that he looks at things from the grassroots on to the top levels, which is crucial. Professor Jody Williams did say and alert us to the problems of rapacious capitalism or corporatism, but I must say there are some good stories as well, and one of those is the work, you mentioned McDonald's piece, of Joan Kroc and the legacy that she left in supporting peace studies, and she, of course, from the McDonald's family. And so we do find people that do give back and are socially conscious and are involved in their communities, as Professor Williams advocated. So coming from that school at Notre Dame University, we're very happy to have the co-founder of the Kroc Center, which is one of the most notable American programs. And there's another one, by the way, at San Diego that she founded as well, University of San Diego. So she was really committed to these concepts and ideas. And perhaps Professor Robert Johansen can tell us how that grows and has grown at Notre Dame.
It's a great joy for me to be here and to share this conversation with my good colleagues and with you. And I want especially to celebrate the contribution that Rotarians have made over many years, a steadfast commitment to increasing international understanding and to peace studies. Rather than talk about the Kroc program of international peace studies at Notre Dame, I want to talk about 4 findings of peace research and then make 10 quick recommendations for the direction that I think peace studies ought to move in the future. And you can see that this is going to reflect what we're actually doing at the Kroc Institute. But I'm very pleased, of course, with our program, which does include both undergraduate, master's, and PhD work. Okay, to the findings then. Peace is not merely a consequence of war prevention. It's not a side effect. You've often heard, if you want peace, prepare for war. Or you've heard the best way to prevent war, wait till I get this working. The best way to prevent war is to be ready to win it. These sayings are widely believed, yet there are 2 errors in this way of thinking. First of all, they give the false impression that peace is merely a consequence of being militarily strong. Peace is treated somewhat like a default setting, something that just happens if you're able to defeat any adversary you may have in war. Second, this thinking also ignores that pursuing high levels of military preparedness to defend our side will actually end up threatening the other side. It's what we often call the security dilemma. The harder we strive to be strong, the more we unintentionally motivate others to increase their military power to strengthen themselves, which then threatens us in a vicious cycle. So if all we know about peace is that we want to be able to defeat any adversary in a war, we still have a lot to learn, because peace does not just happen by focusing on military preparedness. So that's one of the foundation stones, I think, of peace studies. The second finding: to be sustained, peace needs to be planned and deliberately built. Planning for peace is even more important than planning for war, because peace building is harder than war fighting. Imagine the grand strategy for peace and effective international institutions we would have if we devoted as much money, effort, and equipment to peace building as we do to military preparedness. Third, effective peace building requires smart policies. What are these? Well, these begin by addressing fears felt by everyone, their fears as well as our fears, because at the root of all war is fear. Doing this means educating everyone about their human rights and upholding those rights, starting with the right to life, which includes the right not to suffer arbitrary death from genocide or war or oppression. It also means taking everyone's right to peace seriously, implementing everyone's right to food, and the economic right of everyone on earth to a job. Taking all these fundamental rights together means we should commit ourselves to human security as a goal. Human security can be seen as an enlightened understanding of national security because it recognizes that one society cannot be secure for long if others are deeply insecure. Peace not only requires smart policies, but also smart structures. And by structures, I mean both international institutions and international laws. Peace cannot be sustained until it can be institutionalized. To institutionalize it, we need a rule of law in world affairs, just as we do in domestic affairs. Toward this end, the United States and all countries should respect international law and help international institutions like the United Nations, the World Trade Organization, the International Criminal Court and other such courts, the European Union, the Paris Agreement on climate change. Good international laws and institutions advance human freedom, and they make all states' conduct more predictable, more just, and accountable to the international agreements that might limit military buildups, stabilizing the world economy and environment, and upholding human rights. So if we want a rule of law global society, we cannot confine our initiatives merely to fine-tuning the present system. Initiatives need to reorient us and carry us beyond the present system, which is governed by military power. We actually can illustrate how this reorientation might work, even with a hard case like Syria. You know, the motto for U.S. policy there has been, President Assad must go. Well, a better motto would be, the killing must stop. Of course, it would be good for Assad to go because evidence suggests he's committing war crimes. But this way of formulating the policy starts by identifying an enemy and then choosing sides in the conflict, which immediately pits all of Assad's friends against us and us against them. And this blocks cooperative action. If instead our emphasis was the killing must stop, this would not name a particular enemy, and it would not choose sides, but it would ask conduct to follow an existing law, a law that everyone can endorse, the law which specifies that killing civilians is not acceptable, never, even in battle, not by anyone, whether considered our ally or adversary. This emphasis would strengthen the idea of establishing a rule of law society respectful of every person on earth. and it would be opposed to any conduct that would kill civilians, whether by friend or foe. There's no statute of limitations for prosecuting war crimes, so individuals who violate this law could be prosecuted whenever possible, but nations, entire nations, would never be assumed to be guilty. Here are the 4 peace research findings in their simplest form. They can help address new fears that are now arising in the United States, in Europe, and elsewhere, fears that are both causes and consequences of narrow forms of nationalism, of militarism, racial, ethnic, and religious prejudice, and indifference to democratic values. Peace research and education can work much better if each of us do something to implement the following 10 recommendations, which I'm just going to list quickly. First, we should explore how to expand people's primary identity with their own nation into a more inclusive identity, to enable people of one nation to identify with all people on earth, while still honoring particular national identities that are healthy. Second, we must enhance human rights, especially of women and children, because support for human rights gives every person on earth reason to work for peace, stability, and law. Third, we need to study how to nurture democratic values in order to prevent the loss of democracy in societies like the United States that have had it in the past, and also because democratic societies are unlikely to make war on other democratic societies, and they're much more likely to build justice at home. Fourth, peace studies needs to emphasize caring for the commons and maintaining environmental health to increase human flourishing and reduce tensions leading to violent conflict. Fifth, we need to emphasize equity and equality of opportunity as an antidote to hatred and polarization. You know, if one compares the wealth of the richest 1/5 of the world's population to the poorest 1/5, the inequities have steadily increased from a ratio of 3-to-1 back in 1820, on the left in this graph, now to a ratio of 82-to-1 in 2007. We cannot build peace without changing this international economic system. Sixth, in research and teaching, we need to emphasize how to abolish poverty in order to overcome the single biggest cause of terrorism, war, and denial of human rights. World poverty kills 1/3 of all human beings born into our world, and its eradication would require no more than 1% of the GPT throughout the world. Perpetuation of this international economic system and its poverty violates the economic rights of nearly 2 billion people. By helping to impose the present global institutional order, we are participants in the largest human rights violation in human history. Think of that. Seventh, we must do psychological research to show how the psychological health of political leaders and citizens can be measured and nurtured. We must develop indicators of maturity and of peacefulness and pugnacity to give us insight into how to select leaders and how to do peace building more effectively. Eighth, we need to create international electronic classrooms, maybe on Skype, maybe on other electronic means, but this needs to be done to enable students from different countries to talk directly to each other about how to be responsible global citizens, even if their own national governments are not. Ninth, we need to explore how individuals can expand the rule of law in global affairs by discussing this idea with family and friends and motivating members of Congress or members of Parliament to support the idea. And 10th, we need to study what the consequences would be of students committing themselves throughout the world to what I'm calling non-killing societies and institutions. Even though a non-killing ethic cannot be instantly achieved, a large number of people committed to this aspiration could move governments to begin creating rule of law institutions in a global peace system. That's what each of us can work at in the coming days and years. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and I would note your stimulating comments. You mentioned the Universal Declaration of Rights and the right to food. State of Michigan and the city of Detroit have been, I'm happy to say, I'm somewhat unhappy to say, but we should note, have been instrumental in the enunciation of the right to water and clean water, which Rotary is extremely interested in as a human right because of some very grave difficulties we've had with our local water systems because of public policy. So that's something else to note, that we have improved a little bit. And I would invite people with questions to come to the center aisle, where I'm told there's a microphone that you can use to raise questions with the panel. On the issue of good news, a Rotary friend of mine the other day questioned whether the human species is inherently perhaps violent. Look at all the stuff we do to each other. And one has to note that there is some argument from our research, some notion of good news. If you look at the sweep of human history, it's been argued by Professor Steven Pinker at Harvard that humans are becoming, if you can believe this, less violent. And the indicators for this are somewhat controversial, because you have to look at some anthropological digs to figure out the violence of those past periods. But we can note with some pride, I think, that certain things are now taboo. Certain things are not allowed anymore, such as human sacrifice. We do have human trafficking, which many would argue in a way is human sacrifice, but it's not quite the same as it was practiced in those days. Slavery is, again, something that has been normatively abolished, but again, we have slippage and we have real human slavery in the world. So we've got a ways to go, but we are aspiring, in Professor Pinker's words, to our better natures. The more we build rules, the more we establish institutions which can help enforce rules and make them desirable. So we do have some benefit there. And before we turn to questions, and I want to do that real quick, I wanted to give you a brief, just a brief rundown of the latest findings in one of our leading journals, the Journal of Peace Research, which is produced in Oslo, just to whet your appetite for some of the interesting things we get into in peace research. This is the latest edition, table of contents, and in the table of contents are the following articles. Using night light emissions for the prediction of local wealth. That's an interesting use of technology. Lessons from near real-time forecasting of irregular leadership changes. Did we just have an irregular leadership change? I'm not sure. But those are normally overthrows. And what do they mean for the prospect of violence? Canaries in a coal mine, what the killing of journalists tell us about the future repression. Moscow. That was not in the title, I just added that. What does the killing of journalists tell us about future repression? Subnational violent conflict forecasts for sub-Saharan Africa using climate-sensitive models. The role of climate change in producing war has been traced in places like Syria and contributing to it, and in sub-Saharan Africa. So these are just some of the things that can excite our young students, hopefully, to get into this field and look at some of these specific researchable questions. So the audience, please tell us what's on your mind.
Well, thank you. Thank you each for your presentations and sharing your insights and experience and delving into this. My question goes to something I heard from Jody this morning about whether your program specifically engaged the learners in what, for lack of better phraseology would be becoming effective change agents in the world and becoming that global citizen. So not just the research component of this, but also the essence of change. I note American Political Science Association report from a few years ago was talking about the real need specifically for educating U.S. students to be actively politically engaged. So any comments that you have on those two aspects, I'd appreciate. Thanks.
You want to take two or three, or do you want to answer them in turn? You can. Let's hear, and you'll remember. Okay, let's have the next question too.
My question is quite related. I'm very interested in what your graduates end up doing. A way to put that question is, what's the market for people with doctorates in peace studies, et cetera? Thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
Odile Huguenot-Heber. I want to thank Dr. Johansen for giving us 10 substantive points in peace studies. I just wonder, weapons are made because they give jobs to people and they make some community or some people rich. So shouldn't a substantive point be like economic conversion? So we would move from a weapon economy to an economy that would build infrastructure instead of weapon. We spend so much money into it, and the US is about to spend another $3 trillion in nuclear weapons, or $3 billion, you know. Those numbers are so amazingly big that it's hard to grasp them. Thank you.
Yes, sir.
I'm Alan Haber. I'm an Ann Arbor activist. In Ann Arbor, and I hope this World Peace Conference can get local, the chief question in my view and many people's is there's a piece of land in the center of our city, publicly owned land, that many people in Ann Arbor have signed a petition that this land should be kept in public ownership and developed as a community park, commons, as first articulated, a place for the creation of a culture of peace and nonviolence for the children of the world. Though we have heard that as politics works, corporate greed and power it's called, the city government wants to sell this public land for a high-rise luxury apartment hotel. How does Rotary in Ann Arbor and Rotary allies all over the world focus on how do we make in our town a place for peace and nonviolence in the center of our city and not have it sold for a luxury apartment? This sale is against the 1871 Civil Rights Act, the Ku Klux Klan Act, that prevents local rules from abridging a federally guaranteed constitutional right, such as we have to petition the government for a redress of grievance, the grievance being they want to sell our public land.
Thank you,
How do we
Alan.
enforce our public constitutional rights? Is this a question for the Rotary? Thank you.
Thank you. By the way, Alan, wherever he goes, brings a peace table with him, which he made himself out of beautiful wood, which is a symbol that we should all be sitting around the table. I think we should probably try to answer these few and then take the next batch. So anybody who wants to chime in? Sean, yeah.
Wonderful questions. Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Can you hear me now? I think in terms of, first of all, getting students involved in terms of action praxis, as we call it, is really important. So in our master's program, we have practicum courses where students work with non-governmental organizations or city agencies doing social justice work in our city in Winnipeg, but also overseas. And we do, as faculty, have lots of intervention projects that we're working on that we bring our students in and get them involved in those. So that's one thing. The other question was about what do graduates of peace studies programs do? What I'm finding in our program is that most of our master's graduates are working with non-governmental civil society organizations or government agencies. And for our PhD graduates, there are 20. 16 of those have faculty positions, either in peace and conflict studies programs, or in, say, social work or education, where they're bringing peace education or peace practices into those disciplines. And our other graduates are working with government or international agencies. In terms of the sort of, I guess, local issue with regards to the park, it kind of leads to the public space issues. It leads to something I've been thinking about for a long time. I think we need to make a paradigm shift away from the idea that from a consumer-based, from consumerism, to another kind of paradigm. Because as our speakers have shown and illustrated earlier this morning, our environment, our planet is at risk. And in order to give the same opportunities, economic opportunities to every citizen on this earth, we would need the resources of 4 planet Earths, and that's not possible. So I think we need to really think about making that paradigm shift sooner rather than later. Thank you very much.
Owen?
Thanks. Yes, I mean, one of the nice things about a lot of our students in Bradford is that they come as activists. And so it's not so much a question of creating active citizenship, but working with that and the co-development process. Several of the staff are very active, including myself. And so in a sense, it's just a question of making sure there's an openness combined with certain strategic trainings at certain points. And so that's particularly true of the master's programs, which I always fall in love with every year. Not only the Rotary, I should say again, the Rotary Peace Fellows program from Rotary International is a very impressive program, but one of the selection criteria is that they've done things and have already demonstrated a commitment, and that's true of an awfully high proportion of our students. But still they come with incomplete experience, obviously, and so we try and round that out. In terms of careers, it's very wide-ranging. So one of the things that is the pleasures of teaching in an institution which focuses on peace studies is just how many places you find your graduates 10 years later doing all sorts of exciting stuff. And we're as proud of the people that are community leaders in downtown Tokyo or Manila or whatever as we are with that we actually have some presidents who are past alumni. So they do vary, but agreed. Nowadays, it's a creative scene in the sense that you don't have to choose whether to become an NGO activist or working with government or working with international organizations. If you develop comparative advantage and you know what you're doing, there are ways of linking that, and that reflects the complex coalitions that are necessary in order to achieve stuff. On the arms question, it's an important point. Historically, we've done quite a lot of work on conversion in Bradford, in other words, looking at industrial ways of managing decline of defense expenditure. Now, the US and UK and places have a very different context than many others. So one of the points that I often find myself making when engaging with governments, but also local communities, is that, for example, it's amazing how often defense industries are defended as strategic, even though they're making less money. You could create many more jobs by stopping to subsidize them. And so I could quote a number of countries on that, but it's extremely interesting to see how much change over the last 15 years has opened that out. There was a time when every government assumed that their first duty was to protect their arms industry in some way. Even though these are tiny industries, we're talking about a whole global arms trade, even including the US contributing to that global arms trade, which is less than Apple, in terms of turnover and production. And so this is a very manageable challenge, but obviously, and I'm a frequent visitor to Russia, and Russia has a particular reverse. After a period of time of sort of faltering efforts to think about diversifying an economy which was 55% dependent on arms, one of the Putin strategies is to reinvest. So now it's all about arms again, which I think in the short term is pleasing a lot of post-industrial countries, but in the medium term is not much value to them. On the environment, I won't elaborate more than that, except to say in Bradford, we spend a lot of time wondering about those questions, but in fragile states and conflict-affected countries, where there are genuine, all of those normal disputes that preoccupy people in Detroit and UK and what have you, but obviously you're not dealing with the context of reliable rule of law and formal justice systems. And so, but nevertheless, there are all sorts of resources you can draw upon, but you have to recognize very clearly what exists rather than what ought to exist, and then try and work with all of the communities and others to try and make that better.
So Robert?
Yes, I want to address the question especially of what people with peace studies degrees may do. And I want to underscore that on the program this afternoon, there is a PhD graduate from Notre Dame's program, Ashley Greene, who's going to be talking specifically about how PhD studies in peace studies may be applied. But we have found at Notre Dame that because peace studies is interdisciplinary, and because it touches people's lives at many different points, there's no single career path by any means for what happens with somebody with peace studies. A few years ago, the valedictorian of the undergraduate class, who was a pre-med student, and she ended up going to Harvard Medical School, spoke at commencement and said that what changed her life at Notre Dame most of all was her involvement in the peace studies program. So even though she was a pre-med student, she also had a minor in peace studies. And we're finding that peace studies is applicable in almost any other professional degree. At the master's level, usually the people will go into conflict transformation or conflict management or resolution as a practice. On the PhD level, they're usually going into other university teaching and research positions because there is a need, very pressing need, for further research on peace issues so that we can address in a more effective way all the problems that we have. I just wanted to say also that on the question of spending, of course it is true that we need to reorient economies in a major way away from military production to non-military production, and it will, in many cases, often generate even more jobs. The problem is the transition period. In the short run, if a large contractor doesn't get another contract, they feel they're really throwing workers out of work. But over the long run, they will find that the employment actually will increase if there is economic conversion away from military production. So we just need to do, in that case, also much more education.
I think we're up against a bit of a time pressure, but if you could be very brief with additional questions, and I'll ask the panel to just choose, pick and choose, not comment on all of them. Yes?
What are your universities and others like you doing to bring typically underrepresented populations up into leadership? Where are the women? Where are the people of color? Why is this panel all white men standing here in front of me today?
I knew we were going to get that, and we did reach out to some women who were not available for this panel, but I must say yes.
As a young professional going in, finishing up my MBA, trying to go into nonprofits, I would love to see more other people up here. Where is the LGBTQ? Where are women? Where are people of color?
Thank you.
My question's about the refugee crisis. So how exactly do you convince someone who's fervently opposed to accepting more refugees that they deserve like basic rights, rights to education, rights to a better life?
Yeah.
I'd like to circle back to the earlier point about Dr. Steven Pinkner's research in our evolution to becoming a less violent species, and specifically the behaviors that are now considered taboo. And my question is, how can we really start to begin to understand the role of psychological studies in combating violence? For instance, why is it that cannibalism is something that is so taboo in our society that no one even talks about it, yet rape is a very common crime of war?
Our question is, what's the best way to institute peace at our school?
I'm wondering where the discussion of why as a species we exist fit into your curriculum. So do I exist to serve others? Do I exist to consume? Do I exist to dominate? The big philosophical questions in a language and a story that inspires the best of who we can be and want to be. So we have patience to in fact plan for and take 100 years, 1,000 years to create more peace.
Hello. My question is in regards to gentrification and many of the major cities that are in the U.S. right now, and the exploitation of many of, particularly in the urban communities, the pushing out of many of the youth as well as families that are in the cities and being pushed out and displaced, particularly in regards to education and how we can continue to place these families and students, kids, if you will, into better education systems and how we can better fit their needs. Thank you.
Thank you. I might say briefly, by the way, just speaking from the Wayne State perspective, that we do have we're blessed with a very diverse student population, and we have engaged in numbers, I think rather significant numbers of minority students in peace studies at the undergraduate level and increasingly at the graduate certificate level that we offer. So we do have very keen awareness of the need to bring diversity into our field. But gentlemen, other responses?
Certainly, it's very important to emphasize the role of women in peace studies. Women often are better peacemakers than men. I won't essentialize either gender, but there's a lot of research that demonstrates the importance of women's participation, not only in peace studies, but in every governmental level, every decision-making context. Over half of our applicants are women in our program, and they often do obtain employment just as readily as men. So I think this is an important point, and it can be represented, should be represented in this panel as well.
And for that question on school and peace, we in Detroit Rotary have undertaken 2 Interact clubs with theme for peace, nonviolence, at Osborne High School and the Detroit International Academy High School. So we want to spread that word throughout the Detroit system and in the city and in the suburbs. We're undertaking efforts to outreach for dialogues on issues of Islamic understanding in the communities, using Rotary clubs hopefully to host those dialogues. So there's a great place for Rotary in peacemaking in schools and communities.
Yes, great set of questions. Can't address them all. On the humanitarian one, I mean, I think obviously there's a lot of people for whom you can just appeal to human solidarity. I think there are 2. When you're talking to skeptics, I think there's often a tremendously limited knowledge about the scale of acceptance of IDPs and refugees in the poorest communities in the world. I spend a lot of time in Africa, Asia, and so on, and there, you know, just the percentage reception compared with Europe, for example, is just so much greater. Doesn't mean to say that there aren't real challenges in those countries about how to make that more, how to manage that receptiveness. But I think to talk about arguments, that's the main thing, you know, the main thing that we're not sacrificing that much compared with an awful lot of other countries. I think the other one, which is maybe a bracing question for us, is that, and I was I was working with international humanitarian aid agencies relatively recently, and there was a frank admission across those that people have been talking about laws, norms, rules too much in a way that, of course, those matter. I think those matter, but it means that we've stopped to argue the practical reasons why this really matters. It's not just a question of obeying international law or something. International law and norms have emerged from hard experience. And we've now, as that process develops, we've got to renew our discussions, it seems to me, particularly about IDPs. This is the internally displaced people, which is the great majority, where international law is extremely vague in practice. And so I think get back to realities as well as appeal to international solidarity. There was one other question, I think, which I'll address. At Bradford, we do have very active schools programs, and perhaps very similar, about dealing with conflict constructively. One thing we're not trying to do in peace studies is reduce the amount of conflicts in the sense of divisions within society. Those exist. The question is that they're managed creatively and constructively and don't create conflict formations that raise risks of violence. But just to finish, because I don't have time to answer some of the other questions, we realized with embarrassment 15 years ago in Bradford that we were spending more time on poor local communities in Lagos or Rio de Janeiro or the Philippines or different places like that, which of course deserve it. And there we were in the north of England, not with explicit programs dealing with that. And so that's something, there's a difficult balance there because in the end you can't do everything. But we have invested a lot more over the last 15 years and much more that we can be proud of. But it was definitely a moment. And that's part of the good thing about being a part of a peace studies community. We should constantly be challenging ourselves about what we know and our priorities. and combining the vision thing, as it were, with the issue of starting from where we are and trying to build those coalitions that will make a difference in the near term.
Thank you so much for these fine questions, excellent questions, and for you being here. Thanks to my colleagues. We'll see you this afternoon.